Welcome back to the next session of our conference. We've got our first presentation, which is Chris Lezotte. And she'll be presenting on women and automobiles across two continents, and unfortunately brief historiography of women's automotive scholarship in Australia and America. So Chris, over to you.
All right. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to this impressive group of automotive historians. I'm Chris Lezotte, a Detroit native, former writer of car commercials, and independent scholar. Although I am not by definition a historian, I rely on the work of historians to inform my work on women and automobile culture. Next. This presentation, women in yeah, there you go. This presentation, Women in Automobiles Across Two Continents, will address some of that scholarship. Next. Since the turn of the 20th century and the beginning of the motor age, writers of various persuasions and multiple locations have set upon the task of documenting the automobile's vast and varied history. The first automotive histories of auto companies, auto industry leaders, and popular accounts of the automobile's impact began to appear in the early 1920s. Scholarly examinations of automotive history first entered the scene in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Influenced by the cultural turn, historians looked beyond the auto industry and its internal dynamics to consider the automobile's impact on society. Next. Yet, although scholarship witnessed the incorporation of women into various national and international histories during this period, automotive history, a stubbornly male-dominated discipline, was slow to recognize women as influencers and participants in automotive culture. It wasn't until the late 20th century that 5 feminist historians, 2 Americans, 1 Brit, and 2 Australians, began the necessary, if not groundbreaking, process of writing women into automotive history. Next. Women's automotive history is not only about exceptional women in automotive, but is also concerned with the role of the automobile in women's lives. Women's automotive history challenges common perceptions of women's engagement with the automobile as it uncovers the strategies called upon by female motorists to become recognized as legitimate automobile owners and drivers. It addresses the gendered assumptions built into automotive engineering and marketing, as well as how those assumptions influenced how women as drivers are regarded and portrayed. Next. As a discipline, it revises current automotive history to include women as drivers and influencers, contributes to a broader understanding of women's presence and involvement in automobile culture, and accomplishes what historian Joan Hoff Wilson defines as a feminist approach to history. The actual status of groups of women should be described from their point of view and then compared with the status usually assigned to them as isolated objects judged exclusively by male standards. Next. This brief presentation examines the trajectory of women's automotive history scholarship in both Australia and the US to consider how women's automobility has been addressed. Beginning with popular histories of the 1950s and moving through the early 21st century, it investigates the impact of women's automotive history in both locations, considers the manner in which the histories diverge and overlap, and questions how and whether such scholarship has altered the dominant masculine narrative concerning the automobile and car culture. Next. Popular histories of the automobile, written for the general public, combine interesting sociological observations with industrial history. Both Australia and the USA produced narratives of this description during the 1950s. Story of Australian Motoring, published in 1956 and compiled by Keith Windsor, is a collection of essays from various authors that focus on the automotive histories of different geographical areas on the continent. The volume includes many photographs, anecdotes about driving in various states and territories, and commentary regarding the changes brought on by the automobile. In terms of women's participation in automotive history, there are photos that include women as passengers, but the individuals are neither referred to nor identified. A poem that serves as the book's introduction includes the only female reference. This is the final section. You drove along your blissful way and thought, this is the life. But even in that distant day, you wrecked without the wife. For then was born the motorist curse, our backstreet driver dame. Instead of better, she's got worse. She'll always be the same. 100 years from now, I ween, she will be with us still, as nagging as she's always been. Watch where you're driving, Dill. Oh, cars may change in shape and look, so that you'll know them never, but wives are like the poet's brook. Yes, they go on forever. Next. Women driver stereotypes emerged in the early 20th century as a response to a growing interest in driving among the female population. The fear of women's desire to expand their social and economic horizons through automobility was very real. Consequently, critics often used humor to disparage the driving skills of novice female drivers. Any interaction between women and cars was suspect. Those who could not drive were portrayed as shrews who critiqued men's driving. As Catherine Parkin notes, the stereotype of women as backseat drivers empowered men to mute women's guidance and feedback. While the notion of women as backseat drivers is often credited with originating in the USA, the inclusion of this poem in the opening chapter of an Australian automotive history suggests the stereotype was universal. As an example, the image on the left is from the US and the photograph on the right is from Australia. Next. Get a Horse, The Story of the Automobile in America, written by M.M. Musselman in 1950, devotes an entire chapter to the women driver, but not always in a positive fashion. In The Lady at the Wheel, Musselman attributes the eventual failure of the electric vehicle to its ladylike features and its designation as a women's car. Although women, in fact, were interested in the power and range provided by the gasoline-powered automobile, the press portrayed them as flighty, nervous, and inept, as well as mentally incapable of making the instant decisions necessary at speeds over 25 miles per hour. As these two mid-century examples suggest, although the automotive histories of America and Australia were significantly different, the stereotypes applied to women were remarkably similar. Next. The first social histories of the automobile started to appear in the mid-1960s. John B. Ray's The American Automobile, A Brief History, is often considered the first scholarly treatment to combine an analysis of the economic, political, and cultural dimensions of the automobile. Although women represented over 40% of registered U.S. drivers in 1965, Ray only refers to them in relationship to men, primarily as the housewife. While Ray does acknowledge women's automobile use for running errands and dropping off husbands at train stations, he does so rather disparagingly. As he writes, since the husband and father spends most of his day elsewhere, suburbia is definitely a matriarchy. This social phenomenon may be ranked as one of the major consequences of the automobile. By relegating women to the housewife, Ray perpetuates a popular stereotype that women's automobile use is strictly in service of husband and family. Next. What might be considered the first social history of the Australian automotive industry was published in 1969. Smoke, Smell, and Clatter, written by John Good, combines general automotive and motorsports history with analysis of the automobile's effect on Australian culture. Good relies on historical photographs and illustrations from automotive sources in his personal collection, as well as archival accounts and anecdotes to address how the automobile impacted the Australian way of life, including leisure, work, production, sport, and family. A section of Good's chronicle is devoted to women's influence on car buying. Good does not present women solely as sharers of the family automobile. Rather, he refers to both housewives and businesswomen as major car buyers in their own right. He refers to female consumers as a group with minds of their own. In Good's account, the female motorist is presented as an individual with agency rather than a male appendage, which in retrospect was quite revolutionary in mid-century automotive histories on any continent. Next. The first histories of women's participation in car culture came not from automobile literature, but from the field of technology studies. In 1983, Ruth Schwartz Cohen, writing about changes in household technology during the period of U.S. industrialization, included the motor car in her examination. Prior to the 1920s, Cohen observed, shopping and the transporting of goods was performed primarily by men and servants. Industrialization altered the makeup of the home. As separate sphere ideology took hold, women became responsible for household chores, which included the transportation of goods and children. As Cohen writes, the automobile had become to the American housewife of the middle classes the vehicle through which she did most of her significant work, and the work locale where she could most often be found. Cohen was the first to suggest that rather than making life easier for middle-class women, the automobile significantly increased women's workload. Next. James Flink's The Automobile Age, published in 1988, is often considered the most influential automotive history of its time, concentrating primarily on the U.S. industry, but also incorporating an international perspective. Flink offers both a critical survey of the development of automotive technology and the automotive industry, and an analysis of the social effects of automobility on workers and consumers. Flink's overarching objective in The Automobile Age is to illustrate how the automobile transformed American life. While Flink does include women in his investigation, it is within the context of women's roles as wives and caretakers. He often refers to women in the singular as mother, which suggests that the importance of cars to women was in their use as domestic technologies rather than any source of pleasure or work transportation. However, what is perhaps most significant in Flink's assessment of the female automotive consumer is a citation of Cohen's scholarship. This is most likely the first instance of a male automotive historian including and acknowledging the contribution of a feminist historian. Flink's assertion that cars have probably had a greater impact on women's roles than on men's, therefore, is not to be taken in a solely positive manner, but regarded in the context of Cohen's work, that the availability and popularity of the automobile often made women's lives more difficult. Although The Automobile Age can be criticized for its narrow view of the female motorist, it can also be commended for taking the contributions of a female historian seriously. Next. The next major automotive history to come out of Australia was A Nation on Wheels, Australia and the Motor Car, authored by Shane Burney and published in 1984. It is an oversized volume filled with a great number of images and advertisements. As such, has important value as a photographic history of the automobile in Australia. While the book includes many examples of men's relationship to the automobile as participants in auto organizations, motorsports, muscle car culture, and car modification, the female motorist is never mentioned. The photographs include many images that include women. However, the women are positioned as passengers and enthusiastic spectators, rarely as drivers. Burney's book would have one believe that in the mid-1980s, Australian automobile culture was an exclusive male domain where women were invited to observe but not participate. In terms of women's automotive history, it is a significant step backward from the work produced by Australian John Good 15 years earlier. When I got to this photograph, I was so excited because I thought it was a woman driving the car. And then I remember that in Australia, cars are right-hand drive. So, oops. Next. Although through the 1980s, women were sometimes included in histories of the motor car, it wasn't until the following decade that scholarship was produced in which the female motorist was the sole subject rather than an afterthought. In Taking the Wheel, Women in the Coming of the Motor Age, Virginia Sharp produced groundbreaking scholarship that revisited and challenged male automotive history by placing the female motorist at the center of the investigation. Sharp offers a detailed social and cultural analysis of how automotive decision makers called upon gender to shape the production and marketing of the motor car as a means to separate women's automobile use from that of men. The author notes that while the automobile was called upon in the performance of domestic tasks, it was also used as a tool for group advancement in the suffrage cause, in worker pleasure as professional racers and cross-country tourists, and during World War I as mechanics, teamsters, and ambulance drivers. As one reviewer noted, besides providing historical context for the enduring woman driver stereotype, Sharp's narrative sheds new light on the masculine creation myth of the early automotive industry. Next. While Sharp's work focused primarily on white urban women, Catherine Jellison turned her attention to how women use cars in farming communities in the U.S. Entitled to Power, Farm Women and Technology, Jellison calls upon sources such as advertising and women's correspondence to illustrate how patriarchal farming culture framed women's automobile use. Unlike women in the city, rural women were encouraged to drive as part of their expected role within the family. While men worked in the fields, women drove into town for tractor parts and supplies. Like their city sisters, they were also responsible for transporting children and for purchasing consumer goods for the family, often driving great distances to do so. Farm women used the car for part-time jobs, as well as to attend club meetings or to visit relatives in distant communities. While the investigations focus on very different cultures, Scharf and Jellison each bring attention to how gender was often called upon to manage or constrain women's car use. Next. Kimberly Weber, in the 1998 article in Cars and Culture, calls upon motoring journals, automotive advertisements, and women's autobiographies to inform her investigation of women's automobile use in Australia. Such resources, notes Weber, suggest a dichotomy between how the automotive industry viewed the female motorist and how women actually experienced the automobile. Much like in the US, the electric, with its slow speed and limited range, was promoted as the woman's car. As Weber argues, while advertised as the perfect vehicle in which to shop and make social calls, the electric could be guaranteed not to carry the women of the household beyond acceptable boundaries into the great outdoors. However, as Weber notes, Australian motoring journals reveal a conflicting sentiment that women were not, in fact, looking for the safety and luxury offered by the electric, but turned to the internal combustion engine for speed, power, and independence. Yet rather than advertise the automobile as a vehicle for women's fun and freedom, Australian automotive marketers, much like those in America, called upon gender prescription to position the automobile as a natural extension of a woman's domestic life. Next. The influence in Scharf and Weber is evident in the feminist scholarship produced at the turn of the 21st century. Margaret Walsh, a Brit who received graduate degrees in the US, produced a number of works that moved beyond the early years of automobility to address women's car use in post-war America. Beginning with a web-based project for the Henry Ford Museum, Walsh went on to publish a number of journal articles devoted to the history of women in automobiles in the US. Like many historians influenced by the cultural turn, Walsh relied on both primary and secondary sources to construct fascinating accounts of the woman driver during a particular era of American life. In doing so, she challenged and revised the male automotive narrative through the consideration of gender in the history of automobiles. Next. It was during the first decade of the 21st century that Australian scholar Georgine Clarkson embarked on an expansive project that addressed women's early engagement with an automobile in multiple locations. In Eat My Dust, Early Women Motorists, Clarkson calls upon newspaper articles, travel journals, advertising imagery, and oral histories to piece together stories of women's automotive experiences in her native Australia, Britain, British colonial Africa, and the US. Through these narratives, Clarkson brings attention to the commonality of experiences of women whose automotive interest and knowledge was continually questioned and ridiculed. However, Clarkson breaks new ground through her examination of the broader differences in how women's roles in automotive culture were defined by geography and national identity. What is particularly noteworthy is Clarkson's unapologetic discussion of race, a topic that has been seriously underexplored in traditional treatments of automobile history and culture. Next. The most recent contributions to women's automotive history include Judith Glover and Harriet Edquist's 2015 survey of current research into the Australian automobile industry. Calling upon a variety of resources, the authors investigate women as drivers and mechanics, their opportunities as production workers, as well as designers and engineers in the early 20th century. Glover and Edquist recovers women's stories from the archives to inform an understanding of how Australian women participated in the auto industry in various capacities and locations, despite considerable obstacles and stereotypes regarding women's mechanical ability, technological knowledge, and driving skill. Citing both Weber and Clarkson, the authors move beyond existing research to offer a detailed and comprehensive examination of the female motorist's engagement with the automobile, as well as insight into Australian women's determined and persistent efforts to contribute to the growing automotive industry. Next. In Women at the Wheel, published in 2019, Catherine Parkin combines disparate parts and pieces from a variety of sources to construct an interesting and insightful amalgam of American women's involvement with the automobile. Parkin effectively calls upon these resources to illustrate how the male-dominated automotive industry and cultural forces work to stereotype and diminish the woman driver from the beginning of the motor age until the present day. Through the use of interdisciplinary materials, Parkin effectively and engagingly addresses the male automotive establishment's efforts not only to diminish the women driver, but also to downplay, if not ignore, the challenges women experience in buying, driving, and maintaining automobiles. Next. As this brief examination asserts, traditional automotive histories, whether emanating from Australia or the USA, regarded women's relationship to the automobile in much the same stereotypical manner. Portrayal of women as backseat drivers or as inept, unskilled, and unknowledgeable motorists appears to have few geographical boundaries. Auto manufacturers and marketers on both sides of the Pacific continue to call upon gender prescriptions to constrain and define women's car use. Such universal treatment suggests the ingrained masculinity associated with the automobile and its industries effectively overrides the vast cultural and historical differences between the two nations. Feminist historians have challenged and altered that perception. While scholars on both continents recognize the similarities in how women have been regarded, they also consider how geography and nation influence women's automobile use to assess how women in each country relied upon unique strategies to establish themselves as legitimate drivers. Next. Without an established archive to draw upon, feminist scholars have relied on new, varied, and interdisciplinary resources to construct innovative, if not pioneering, histories of women's relationship to the automobile. These accounts challenge, revise, and provide a necessary counterpoint to the dominant masculine narrative concerning the automobile and car culture. Contemporary automotive scholars, John Heitman and Rudy Bolte in the US and Australia's Graham Davison, for example, have recognized the scholarship of feminist historians such as Cohen, Sharp, Weber, and Clarkson and incorporated it into their respective works. Next. Yet while women's automotive history gains recognition as an important subject of study, additional work needs to be done. Women of color are noticeably absent from the literature, as are women of the working class. While societal and ethnographical studies of women's involvement with cars have started to make an impact, there are dozens of untapped female automotive cultures waiting to be explored. Writing in 1983, Charles Sanford challenged scholars to remedy the lack of literature addressing the relationship between women and the automobile. As Sanford wrote, what is needed is both an intimate feminine viewpoint from several perspectives about women's experience with cars and fairly objective, even statistical, studies of the same experience. Next. Perhaps this brief historiography will serve as an impetus to automotive historians everywhere to consider the influence of over half the population of drivers and to include the actions and influence of the female motorist in present and future automotive histories. Next. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Chris. Fascinating presentation, and really, I think after many years of AHA conferences where we've had, a significant contribution from both female scholars and female topic papers, I think this is a terrific, almost line in the sand that even more needs to be done. Interestingly, Judith, very close colleague of myself, and of course Harriet as well, have done that recent stuff in Australia. But I do just note, the more you scratch the surface in all the research we've been doing in Australia, the more you find the significant contribution of women in the automotive sector, whether it be in the trades, the roles within automotive organisations, companies from very early stage, in the racing scene, and just in the social history more broadly. We find that there are these significant contributions that need to be documented and celebrated. So are there any questions at all from the floor? I do note Alison Wayne from New South Wales, a associate professor of design history and one of our very important committee members here in Australia. Alison, do you want to ask your question of Chris or make a comment?
Yeah, it was actually more a comment.
Yeah.
I will say I'm a heritage person rather than a design person, actually.
Yeah.
And when I was looking into uses of large machinery generally, not just cars, but I came across a really interesting article about Swedish. A couple of researchers in Sweden had interviewed older Swedish women and found that there'd been that they had used the identity of the caring woman to legitimize their car use and ownership, because taking social responsibility and nursing and helping others was embedded. That was really embedded into the norm of the sort of natural woman, and so they used that as a way of saying, well, I need the car. I have to have the car for this, and so that was a strategy used by older Swedish women back in the day. So I just thought that was an interesting other way. It's not just the mom thing, but it's also I help others.
Right, right.
Yeah. Another sort of perspective, I suppose. Yeah.
I've done some work with women in pickup trucks, and one of the comments they make is they like driving pickup trucks because it allows them to help other people. It helps people move, or helps them to transport things, or if they don't have their own transportation. So that's sort of a common thing.
Harriet Edquist, I had a feeling that we would have a point or a question from you. So please take the floor.
Oh, thanks, Chris.
Yep.
No, thanks, Chris. That was terrific paper, real wake-up call to us all. That idea of caring, I think there's two that struck me. The notion of care is really fundamental, and you find it right through the Australian experience. For example, in the First World War, women all got into their cars and they went down to the wharves to pick up the wounded soldiers and would bring them back to hospital or whatever. So there was that idea of using your expertise or using your motor car in that way is absolutely fundamental from the beginning, I think. And of course, the thing that really interests me, because it's because the area of women and domesticity in the suburbs has been reasonably well covered, I've really focused on women and racing driving, because I think that's an area that they actually were given a reasonable amount of freedom. And so Australian women racing drivers, right from the get-go, from the very early, was it a reliability? No, what was the Dunlop? Was that reliability trial or an endurance test or what?
Reliability.
Bit of everything,
Yeah.
Harriet.
But women were in that, I mean,
Yeah,
from
yeah.
1905. So I think I quite like to focus on the areas where women actually had some agency, and I think racing is one of them. But the areas that women have very little agency until recently was in design. When you look at, in fact, my paper has got absolutely no women in it at all. And when you look at the design studios, up until quite recently, there were very few women operating in them. I mean, there might have been some in the interior studios, but not in external styling. Yeah,
I was going to say that people
They're
like
just starting to make
Shireen Joel and others,
that's
who
well,
actually
exactly.
ran Trim,
Oh,
They're
yeah, she
starting to
did.
make an impact here in the U.S. I think General Motors has a number of female designers.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And certainly shifting as well. I think you just see in engineering and design schools, there's more women coming through as a proportion. There's always traditionally a very low level of industrial design and engineering design female participation in the training. So now that's going up. I think you see some changes going on across not just automotive, but other industries too. Paul Berenger, maybe a insider view on.
A couple of comments there. Firstly, on female designers. Harley Earl, of course, of GM was very influential with his design damsels back in the 1930s, where he brought together a group of females who were very much involved in interior design. In fact, probably set the scene for the next decades, where females were seen as colour and trim designers as opposed to exterior. It's a bit like the analogy would be at the home, where the man's outside painting the house and the woman's inside choosing the wallpaper. So it's kind of an exterior man's world and an interior female world. The other point I'd like to make, and really, Chris, I really got a lot out of your presentation. Thank you for that. Was that the media influenced the purchase decision. I can't recall any influential female journalists who reported on the automotive industry in the UK or in the US or in Australia. The influential magazines in the US, like Road and Track, Car and Driver, they were very much male-dominated publications. In Australia, Wheels, Motor, Modern Motor, they are all very much influenced by male journalists or writers who occasionally would defer to their wives for comments about the interior of the car they happen to be road testing. So, in fact, the communication to the mass public about the strengths and weaknesses of particular cars was usually through the eyes of male media people.
I think one of the first in the U.S. to first female who was an active journalist was Jean Jennings, she worked for Car and Driver and she became the editor of Automobile magazine. So she was probably a breakthrough journalist, certainly over here, in terms of she didn't write necessarily about women in cars, but she was a woman in a powerful position at a magazine. So
we had females like Dolores Davis, Peter Davis's wife, who was influential in the background more than the foreground.
Right.
She did write her own book, which I forget the title, but she certainly didn't get articles published under her own name in Wheels when Peter was their editor, for example.
Okay. I think there's some great discussion there. We probably need to move to the next page, but Chris, thank you so much. And everyone, let's give a round of applause to Chris. Such a great paper and a lot to think about for the future as well. I think Chris, you've sort of really challenged everyone on this call and in the room too. So thank you very much.